two of the world's largest democracies are approaching elections. These are very trending topics for conversation. Belief in the democratic process itself is indicative of a citizen's belief in a democracy. For a democracy index to be true to its cause, it needs to be transparent as well as credible. To push forward this cause, the Indian government has decided that an Indian democracy index is the order of the day. And we discussed the kind of groups opposing it. So if you haven't watched that video, then do go check it out. But I do want to discuss the parameters that go into building a true democracy index. This is not an exhaustive list, but this forms part of an article that was very well received in policy circles, which was published for First Post, and I will link that article down below so you can go check it out and leave your comments. But it is quite comprehensive in the kind of parameters that it outlines. So those parameters are what we will be discussing today. If you're joining me for the first time, welcome to Questioning Mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and I discuss all things culture and policy, so if that is of interest, do stick around. We have quite a few topics that will be coming up. So thank you for joining me today, and without further ado, let me list out some of the parameters. The first one that should be obvious is voter turnout percentage. Now, a democracy requires that all people who hold the adult franchise to vote turn out, because that indicates a level of citizen participation, which forms the basis of self-governance. Essentially, we're considering democracy, which was defined in my last video again, so that's something I'm going to let you look at. But just to reiterate, self-governance is something that can be determined by a people's interest in governing themselves, and so voter turnout percentage is something that is of great value. The second thing that one must look at is women voter percentage. Women form a majority of the population in many nations of the world, but due to socio-cultural issues, they have very often across the globe been kept away from the voting circles, and this causes their participation to not be counted as much as that of men. However, they are equal citizens, or should be equal citizens, in a true democracy. The entire population, regardless of gender, should be truly participative in self-governance, without which it is a sham. And so women's voting percentage is something that must be counted for as well. The third one that I'd like to discuss is electoral malpractices, and this includes coercion towards voting for a certain political persona, for a certain political party, and this happens at all levels across the globe. So it can mean violence during voting, pre-polling, post-polling violence. It can include ballot stuffing, booth capturing, and the like. It can also include the much-touted EVM hacking where that possible. Ballot stuffing is something that is done with paper ballots, and India, even the US now, considering mail-in ballots, has a lot of issues with regards to election legitimacy, which is another point that I will discuss. But for now, let's move on to the fourth point, which is judicial freedom and access. Now, elections essentially determine who the people forming the legislative of a country are. These are the people who make and pass policy. Judiciary is an independent organization, or should be an independent organ of the country's system of governance, which upholds the laws that are passed by this legislative body. Their encumbrances when it comes to freedoms needs to be as minimal as possible. In fact, they need to be within the permit of the national constitution only, and not be hampered, for example, by the military, by the legislative body, by the executive, or by corruption. And so the judicial freedom as well as access to judiciary are both important. Now, the second part is very important because this means that the citizenry that should have access to judicial freedom. So Recourse to law is something that should be a fundamental right in a democracy, and as such, that becomes very important. Legislative freedom is the fifth point that I would like to discuss with you. Once a government is elected, the legislature should have freedom to govern. They cannot be held to ransom to vested demands that come from across the country just because someone has more power, whether through media access, whether through money. The elected legislature, now please understand that anyone hampering the government's functioning is going up against the will of its people. You're essentially fighting the country's will. And so this, for a democracy to function, it is detrimental to the functioning of a democracy. So in countries like Serbia, in countries like Hungary, in countries like India even, there's a lot of protests. In fact, all across Europe right now you will see large-scale farmers' protests, and in France you will see a lot of protests against migration. These are people literally fighting the will of the country, of the government that they themselves elected. Now it's the same, yes, we can argue that the same people who elected the government are not comfortable with the government completing its term of 5 years, but this is not typically considered democratic because this goes against the will of the people initially, right? There is a term for the completion of the government. These are all democratic countries that I mentioned, and so we must be cognizant of the fact that whilst changing does not mean that the government must stop functioning in the way that they decided to do. Now, coming to the sixth point, that is the number of parties contesting elections. There are very, very few countries in the world, though, that more than 3 or 4 parties actually contest the elections, whether at a national level or at a smaller level of states or regions. The global south, in this case barring China, does offer a good kaleidoscope of different parties and different interest groups that are part of. Each political party brings a separate interest group, and suppose this were happening at a local level, then local concerns would have a stage to be discussed in. It may be decided due to a lower population or lower population percentage that such issues were not needed to be given a larger stage, and that's completely fine. However, the number of political parties that are contesting an election form a very good basis for understanding how democracy functions at the many levels that they actually occur in, that the people reside in. So were it functioning at a state level, at an even more municipal level, and then at a national level, we would see that democracy actually functions well in such a system. I know it sounds tuned towards providing India a higher place in the rankings, but I'd like you to think about it. For example, town's mayor, even in a European nation, were they to be actually given space to conduct politics at a higher level, were they to run for something, were they to be able to create a party at their level, and mayoral elections having, or maybe not mayoral, municipal elections having different parties participating and bringing different interests to the forefront for the locals to decide on which was more important to them. That would offer a lot of different interests and causes for the people to back, and would cause people to participate in their nation and its building a lot more, and make them aware of the different issues that their own citizens face. The seventh point that needs to be discussed is the barrier to entry for these parties and independent candidates. Now, in certain democracies, the system is just not built to allow for multiple political parties to exist. That's fine. Can independent candidates also contest elections? If this is true, then how many barriers to entry are there for these independent candidates? Now, we know that in a thriving democracy, a lot of democratic functions, elections are truly a function of money, of the power of money. So if a candidate has access to very large donations, then they can function independently, as you may have noticed in the American elections last time, leading up to the current one, which will happen this year. You may have noticed that former Democrats Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy stepped out of the Democrat Party and decided to contest as independent candidates due to certain misalignment with their party's current goals. Now, the barriers to entry of such candidates in any system needs to be lowered for them to also be able to raise the causes of the followers who support them. So, if it is easier for them to bring these issues to fore and be elected from their constituencies, it shows that the function of democracy occurs at lower levels and not necessarily at a level where the money power is the greatest. So then there is campaigning by representatives. So campaigning by representatives means that representatives are actually cognizant of their constituents and are conversing with them. Surely this happens mostly during the time of elections. One may not always be in election mode, but robust campaigning by candidates who represent their constituents is a sign of their entrenchment in the political system, and that means that they actually care about being re-elected. For example, we've seen for decades politicians who decided to never really visit their constituencies, and their constituents kept voting for them for years, either due to fear of violence or that there were barriers to entry of different political systems and candidates. So, and campaigning was simply considered unnecessary. And so the candidates never really campaign in their constituencies. This happens across the globe. This happens in corrupt systems across the nation. And so a truly functioning democracy would see robust campaigning. Now, another point to be noted is the constituents' knowledge of election promises and the representatives. Are you, as a voting citizen, aware of what you're voting for? Have you gone through the manifestos? Have you considered what the promises made might mean in the longer term as well as the shorter term? How is this information spread? Now, there is a lot of media literacy that is available, but that may not be accessible. It is typically the duty of the constituents, of the candidates, of the election candidates, to be discussing these with their constituents and making sure that their promises reach the right ears. Now, this is dependent on media access and access to their constituents' share of attention, and the constituents and the citizens' participation in this process has to be built on knowledge and not merely a day's worth of certain goods or based on freebies. Knowledge is an important indicator of the democratic process. So I believe this is the 10th point, which is citizen participation in governance at grassroots levels. India has seen Zilla Parishad elections. We see these all the time. We see panchayat elections in the villages. We're a very, very vast country with a very, very vast population. So decentralized governance ensures access to governance and administration to all citizens without extreme dependence on a centralized force. Now, in the US, this occurs in a different way. Their system is much more federal, and so states have more power. And so one can see that different, democratic systems have different forms of reaching the ears of people who have political power. And at the same time, one can see that in the Chinese system, everything is incredibly centralized, and the common citizen may not have a means of offering feedback to or making their voices heard to the centralized powers. So this is one of the major things that needs to be accounted for in a democratic index. And another point, coming to the 11th point, I believe, I hope I'm right with the counting, and do forgive me if I'm not. And if you do find value so far and you've stuck around, Do drop a like, it's free. I am going to show you a picture of my cats if you just drop a like on this video. So moving on to the 11th point, and you can see it's an extensive essay, so do read it. It's in the description box again. So public understanding of policy via government publicization. Now, we discussed knowledge being an important part of democracy. It is also something that the government needs to be participating in. One cannot actually just form a government and then keep all of their processes incredibly opaque and not allow for citizenry to know what goes on in the houses of legislature, because these are not hallowed halls of the elite. These are the functionings of an elected legislature, and so policies and policy results, so long-term policy results and the reason for the introduction of such policies, citizenship understanding of such policies, as well as laws, needs to be publicized by the government. And with the incredibly widespread digitization available to governments today, this should not be something that is not really thought about. So in a democratic process, citizenry would know about the policies that they are partaking in, and government should be the one publicizing them as well. Also, I mentioned Zilla Panchayat elections. If you haven't watched my video with candidates, this video is in Hindi, so if you'd like to watch that, it was a very interesting conversation about the campaigning process in a Zilla Panchayat election. Do check that one out. Now, once somebody understands policy, we'll come to the next point. They should be able to offer feedback on said policies. Now, it is a very, very arduous task going through feedback from millions of citizens, and completely understandable if everything is not really responded to. However, there should be feedback mechanisms where a citizen just writes in. So, for example, the RTI in India, the Request to Information Act, is something where a citizen can seek information and then use that information to publish, whether op-eds or editorials or other ways, publicize the information that they received from this act. But really, this isn't enough. There should be a feedback mechanism where surveys are conducted by governmental bodies or other political parties, even at the lowest level, for example at the panchayat levels, where their citizens can participate with logical reasoning for their asks for what they require. Another point that would make sense in a democratic index is leader popularity. A democratic leader must represent the majority of her or his people. A barely popular leader means that they do not represent the will of the people and came on board by through technicality. So this is something that is kind of obvious, and we'll move on quickly to the next one, which is nationalism, which will also be a quick one. People should care enough about their nation to be participating in a democratic process. Nationalism has now got negative connotations due to its association with the socialist nationalist party of Germany, which was the Nazi party. But this has been misused immensely by media and academia to forward an incorrect representation of what nationalism really means, which is interest in national causes, and essentially is often synonymous with patriotism. So a person who cares about national growth, national development, and national wealth, people who care about their nation will participate in a democracy. And so national spirit is an absolute prerequisite for a democratic nation. The next point is law and order. Without a per capita measure of crime and of law and order, it is easy to miss out on criminals who role play as politicians, as this country at least has seen a lot of. But honestly, this happens across the world, across a lot of developing economies as well, and as well as developed economies. So without a measure of law and order in the country, one will miss out on criminals participating as politicians and citizens voting in favor of that criminal just to be able to save their lives, their families, and their livelihoods. This is sort of an obvious, but a functioning democracy needs a functioning law and order system. And the next one is a monopoly on violence by the state. This is sort of running off the first point as well. Law and order includes violence and includes monopoly on violence. And so if it is not the state that is in control, that monopolizes violence, which means the use of, in this case, let us consider the use of force, then any interest group can essentially hold a functioning legislature to ransom by violence. So like I mentioned, the protest. So without monopoly of violence on the state, this process will be derailed. Now let me just clarify that we need to separate access to weaponry from violence, because these are very separate matters. Now, the states of Israel, the nations of Israel, Switzerland, for example, have armed citizenry. However, these citizens do not hold their governments to ransom by use of said weaponry. So the access to weaponry and to armament should not play a role in deciding monopoly of violence by the state. What it means is that violence, the use of force, action against a people is by the state and not by its own citizens, because that is often cause for civil war, etc., and that is not a sign of a functioning democracy. The next point, which is the penultimate one, is the lack of minoritarianism. I expect to get a lot of brickbats for this, but democracy in its most modern form, because it offers universal adult franchise, is an exercise in majoritarian will. This was not always the case. So in ancient democracies, it was often only the elite and often only the men who participated. Due to universal adult franchise being an accepted necessity for democratic functioning, it is also necessary that it represent the will of the majority of its participants. And as such, a lack of minoritarianism is absolutely a good depiction of its correct functioning. Appeasement to minoritarian interests can lead to a tyranny of the minority on the majority, or impose demands upon the majority which are completely not in sync with the majority's will, which is essentially what democracy is. The last point, which I think forms a very necessary parameter of a democratic index that is credible, is belief in election legitimacy. Today we see a lot of rhetoric around EVMs being hacked, around ballot stuffing in the US, about poll capturing in certain states, which is because two of the world's largest democracies are approaching elections. These are very trending topics for conversation. However, belief in the democratic process itself is indicative of a citizen's belief in a nation, in a democracy, and should not be disregarded. It forms a pivotal point in understanding whether a democracy is truly functional or whether it is something that is portrayed for various rhetoric or propaganda building material to create a legacy, which is completely valid as a political tool. However, it is not truly reflective of democratic functioning. So these were some of the pointers. I've written them all down in this article. It's really not hard to read. I hope you do get around to it, and thank you so much for joining me. And if you've stuck around to the end, I hope you find some value in this. I request you to share this. It's very important. I hope you share this with your friends and family, and we will continue discussing such important topics. And thank you for joining me today. I'll see you next time.